Has your involvement with a cause or vocation ever demanded more from you than you were willing to give? Perhaps you started a dream job without realising that you were expected to regularly attend the weekend retreat with mentally unhinged work colleagues, to take part in trust games and be aided by the musical assistance of 𝐒𝐲 or a Ravi Shankar remix. Perhaps you failed to notice in your contract that you were expected to exchange gay repartee with the man seated opposite you every morning, and whose social calendar peaks with Friday nights alone with him, Nuts magazine and a pot noodle. But nevertheless, there are those among us who, when they sign up, and if it costs them their life, then that's exactly what they'll pay. 100 years ago, almost to the day, 2 Latvians were hiding out here on this street in Stepney in London's East End. The reason? They were public enemies #1 after a botched robbery on a jewellery store in Houndsditch 2 weeks prior. On the 16th of December 1910, a group of Latvian revolutionaries attempting to raise funds for their cause back home were knocking through the rear wall of a jewellery shop from their property behind. Now, they had underestimated the power of Britain's Community Watch, Neighbourhood Watch, and a shopkeeper in the area overheard a commotion going on and decided to inform the police. Now, as far as these police were concerned, it was just a noise complaint, and so a handful were dispatched to this address. They knocked on the door, and then all hell broke loose. Bullets were flying, guns going off, because these Latvians were heavily armed. In the melee that followed, 3 policemen were shot, another handful wounded, and one of the Latvians shot one of his comrades in the back in their escape. The London police force suffered their worst loss of life that day, 3 members dying and a handful injured. And the Latvians escaped with their wounded comrade being found 2 days later about a quarter of a mile away. But by then, a massive hunt was underway to catch these criminals. The brains behind this operation was a man named Peter the Painter. Now, admittedly, he was short-changed by whoever hands out fearsome titles. William the Conqueror, Ivan the Terrible, invoke images a lot more unsettling than a short description of a man's private interest in the arts and crafts. But nevertheless, Peter the Painter was said to be an evil genius, and the police were having a hard job catching him. On the 2nd of January 1911, police received an anonymous tip-off that several members of this Latvian gang, including Peter himself, were hiding out on this very street in Stepney in London. Now, determined to get it right this time, they dispatched hundreds of police to this address. The Home Secretary at the time, Winston Churchill, decided that he would turn up and personally oversee goings on. He decided when he arrived that hundreds of police weren't enough, and so he called for backup from the army. And before long, these terrified Latvians were surrounded by the might and power of London's law. Of course, these well-armed Latvians had really only one choice, and so they opened fire, and for 6 hours shots were exchanged between the two sides. Madness was going on this street in Stepney. It was called the Siege of Sidney Street. Bullets flying back and forth, Winston Churchill got one through his top hat, and after hours and hours of battle, a fire broke out in the house. It was said to be started by the revolutionaries themselves. Of course, a fire engine was called, but Winston Churchill, showing the dark side of his character that perhaps some would argue reared its head again in the dealings leading up to Pearl Harbor, decided to keep the fire engine where it was, refusing them to put out the fire. Of course, the house burnt, and in the smouldering ashes, the charred bodies of 2 Latvian revolutionaries were discovered. The siege on Sidney Street made international news, and it was the impetus that the London police force needed to finally improve their ailing arsenal, which was hopelessly outdated compared to their Latvian opponents. It was also the inspiration behind Alfred Hitchcock's final scene in his film The Man Who Knew Too Much. But one mystery still remained, because amongst those smouldering, charred bodies in the house on Sidney Street, there was no sign of Peter the Painter. He'd escaped and was never, ever caught. But his legacy lives on, strangely enough, in Tower Hamlets, where they decided in 2006 to name Peter House and Painter Home after him, which makes London surely the only city in the world that would choose to name its buildings after a cop killer. Some tell tales, others rhyme, but I sing songs from the Howling Sea. If you're wondering what on earth you just witnessed, you've been watching a video from the Songs from the Howling Sea podcast. Each week I release a song and a video about a person or a subject from London's East End. 52 songs in 52 weeks. For more, visit www.songsfromthehowlingsea.com.